It's time to talk about the Germanic sound shift. In a nutshell, we're going to explain why father has an F while Latin has a pater, and why the P in pater is really the ancient Indo-European sound. But something happened in the development of the Germanic languages that made them swap around and use some different consonants. It's a systematic change. We understand it to have been an historical event, that some group of speakers changed their pronunciation, and we describe it systematically in a set of concepts known as Grimm's Law, about which more anon. Do you remember we're talking about the diversification of languages over millennia, which includes cultural transmission and also the movements of peoples. So we might very reasonably imagine that during the spread of language, culture, and indeed the migrations of peoples, some population of Indo-European speakers wound up over here, somewhere on the seacoast of this red territory, which marks the Germanic languages, and for one reason or another began to use different consonants in their words. For a point of comparison, you might think about the various ways that different populations of modern English speakers use the interdental th sound. If many populations of American speakers will say an F sound, a f, instead of th, as in birthday. This is characteristic of some African American vernacular English speakers' practice. It's also characteristic of most South Londoners' practice. They will say south and north and otherwise use an F sound instead of a TH. So it's really not that unusual in the course of language history for a population of speakers to make a small change in a consonant, and then subsequently those people's descendants, or whoever learns the language from them, whether by marriage, conquest, trade, who knows, whoever learns a language from them, their children, for example, will continue that new and changed pronunciation. Something like that happened in English. I shouldn't say English, in Proto-Germanic. And we understand this to have happened around 2,000 years ago, really by the middle of the 2nd century AD, when we get the first runic inscriptions. This change is already mostly complete, and we rarely find a sign of it there. So to map out the basic change, we already know that the Germanic words for father all start with an F, and the other Indo-European words for father all start with a P, as in P. Of course, it's not called a P in Greek, Sanskrit, or Avestan, but it's called a P for us. And so here's what happened. There were Proto-Indo-European speakers using a word like pater, and some group of them wandered off and began to say father instead. Several things happened at once. Both the p and the t changed. One became a f and one became a the, which is, we're going to set that aside for a minute and focus on the f. And also the stress changed to the first syllable, which is another quirk of Germanic pronunciation. The most logical, I shouldn't say most logical, the most generally accepted explanation for why this might have happened is that the Germanic tribes may have wandered into an area where they mixed with a different population and overcame them, so that the Indo-European language, which became Proto-Germanic, prevailed. And we can imagine that being a nice process, but we know enough about history to figure that those sorts of things generally aren't very nice. But at any rate, the influence of a substratum language, a less powerful language during a phase of cultural mixture, may very well have been what triggered this change. Part of the evidence for that is that some particularly Germanic vocabulary that has to do with where Germanic peoples live, like the words for ship, for example, and the sea, are not Indo-European words. And so we presume that probably Germanic tribes mixed with, or I should say Indo-European tribes who became Germanic tribes got that way by mixing with populations who lived on the north coast of Europe, who had their own vocabulary, of course, for stuff like the sea and ships, and some different consonant habits. During that time when they were wandering off into a corner of Europe and switching their P's into F's, these sounds were going along and developing in their own ways in other language families. The p and the t went through Proto-Iranian intact, and they survived into Avestan, and the p survives in modern Persian. Pedar is the modern Iranian word for father. And the same happens for all of these other languages. They go through their proto-phases and they turn up in their attested ancient phases like Latin, ancient Greek, and Sanskrit with that P and the T intact. So this is like a genetic mutation that happened in just the Germanic branch of the family. Or if you don't want to think of it as a mutation, just imagine one member of the family going off and marrying somebody with red hair, and thereafter all the kids in that branch of the family have that red hair. That's something like what happened in the Germanic sound shift. We can substantiate this with a lot of comparative data. If we take a look at those Germanic words for five over there, five, fi, fünf, fem, we can posit Proto-Germanic femfe, which matches that Proto-Indo-European pempe, and there are a bunch of attested Indo-European words with a P in the words for five. Now, I like the Cornish one, pump. That's just a beautiful example of how Grimm's law maps a correspondence, especially if you look at it against German fünf. The same goes for fire. We have English fire, Old English fyr, Old Norse fur, Old Frisian fjord, Proto-Germanic for, and then over there in the other Indo-European languages, we have lots of lovely P words, and like Greek pyre. And of course, we've borrowed that Greek word back into English in words like pyromaniac and pyrotechnic. Take a look at the two Armenian words over there, hing for five and hur for fire. That H doesn't match the Indo-European P's at all, and this should remind us that every branch of the Indo-European language family gets to have its own history and its own little phonetic quirks. Armenian had its own sound change. It wasn't the same sound change as Germanic languages, but it produced some analogous results. Also, take a look at that H2 in the middle of pehur. That is a laryngeal that only is attested in Hittite there, pehur. And on down to the bottom, we have the familiar English fi with German vich, fich, which is cow, and Proto-Germanic fehu against Proto-Indo-European peku, with a bunch of lovely Indo-European reflexes that all have P's in them against those Germanic F's. And remember that the German and Dutch V's spell an F sound, at least historically. What we can say here is that this pattern of correspondence between Germanic F's and Indo-European P's is really thorough. It pervades the entire vocabulary, and the simplest explanation for it is there was a sound shift. At some point, this population of speakers who spoke Proto-Germanic started saying F instead of P, and all of the languages that descend from Proto-Germanic show that change persisting. This was summed up shortly after the year 1800 by a man named Jakob Grimm, and he's really important. Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm are the brothers Grimm who spent part of their time gathering the folklore of northern and central Europe and turning it into Grimm's fairy tales, which now Disney gets to mess around with and twist in all kinds of awful ways. But what Grimm realized, and of course he wasn't working alone, he was part of a field of study, but Grimm realized that we could map out those sounds in Germanic languages, see how they correspond to the sounds that survive in Indo-European languages, and posit a really systematic change in the consonant inventory of Proto-Germanic. And think of it like a genetic mutation in the language. We're not talking about people here. Sorry, somehow my spacing got messed up. And notice how it occurs to groups of sounds. The voiceless stops of Proto-Indo-European p, t, and k all become fricatives. Those sounds change one feature. They're still voiceless. It's just instead of a stop, they're now fricatives. P to f, t to th, and k to ch, and then h. We'll see examples of these in a second. Another group of stops, the voiced stops in Proto-Indo-European, became voiceless stops. They lost one feature. They lost voicing. B became P, D became T, G became K. Now, in most of the other families of Indo-European, the Proto-Indo-European sounds persist. Pater is still pater, and padre in Spanish still has a P in it. It's just in the Germanic languages that Indo-European sound shifted by changing one of its qualities. That's why we call this the Germanic sound shift. The last part of this involves a group of stops that really didn't survive very well in any of the Indo-European languages. So we'll see some interesting, some different correspondences between languages there, but these voiced and aspirated stops again lost one feature and became unaspirated. So an Indo-European or a Proto-Indo-European B became B, and the D became D. And so also with the G became, G. Let's see some examples of how these different changes worked. The Proto-Indo-European voiceless stops become fricatives. We've seen that with P becoming F. And we can map this by looking at the modern attested versions the modern reflexes of Indo-European words. On the left, we have a description of a sound change in history. Some group of speakers gave up pronouncing the Proto-Indo-European P, and they started pronouncing F in their Germanic or Proto-Germanic tribe. The effect of that is, when we look around at the languages that exist now, and that includes our records of ancient languages, we can see that there's a difference between them. The Germanic languages, and I'll focus on English here, will have Fs in words that are cognate with words in other languages that still have that old P. In Greek, pyre still has the P. Latin, pecus still has the P, even though English, as a Germanic language, must have F there. This happens across the voiceless stops. T became th. So English thin is cognate with Latin tenuis, and Spanish tres or tres is cognate with English three. We should expect every time that we see a th in a word in English, if it's an old Indo-European word that came in through Germanic, we should expect to find cognates for it in other languages that start with a T. And the same goes for k, which became ch, that's that X there, and then became h. So we have English hound instead of Latin con-is, and English heart instead of Greek kardios. And we could look for Roman or I should say, Romance cognates too. We have the cor, which comes to us from French, and you have Spanish corazon with a k there. And we have courage, which is French courage, which is your heartiness. So we've got plenty of Romance k words that correspond to these English h words, predictably, because the Old English words, the Germanic words that came into English from Old English, from Proto-Germanic, they show this shift in the consonants. Our voice stops become voiceless, thus, b to p. Now, in fact, there are so few Germanic P's that we suspect there may not even have really been an Indo-European B. This is a weak spot in the scheme, but if there was an Indo-European B, it worked like this. And in fact, the B's that did exist during the period of the sound shift, they did shift. So we see things like lub, ricus, in English, slip, which are cognate and similar in meaning. Of course, that Latin word has to do with being slippery. That's where we get lubricate, borrowed into English, which is why it gets to have the Romance sound. D to T. Decum, and I put the Gothic tehun for 10 there instead of English because it preserves that k to h shift as well. So we get to see both the d and the k shift into Gothic tehun. It happens that in Proto-Old English that H went away, and so we're left with ten there. A Latin domo, which is a verb meaning I tie up or I domesticate, I dominate, is perfectly cognate with English to tame. Now, you notice the vowels don't always add up. There are rules that govern how the vowels correspond and how they've changed over time, but they're really complicated, and we're just going to let them go mostly. And then g to k, of course. Latin gelo to English cool, and Latin genus to English kin. Now, we have plenty of borrowings in English that are based on gelo and genus. Of course, genus is now a word in English, and so are gelatin and even gelato. They all have, or just gel. But remember, those get to preserve the unshifted sound because they are borrowings into English. If the word came up through Germanic and Old English, it has to show the Germanic sound shift, as in kin. So also kind is part of this group too. And then those voiced aspirated stops, they lose aspiration. What we've been seeing so far shows some really clear correspondences, but when we start looking at the voiced aspirated stops, like b, becoming Germanic b, it can be a little trickier to find the cognates in other Indo-European languages because in most Indo-European languages, those voiced aspirated stops shifted in some other way. Once you learn the patterns, they're easy to look for. Now, they survive pretty well in Sanskrit, so bharata corresponds beautifully there to English brother. If you look at the Greek, the spelling with the phi sound, or the phi, is a relic of the ancient sound, but the pronunciation, of course, is fa, as in frater, and of course Latin frater too, which are borrowed into English with words like fraternity, fraternize, and friar, for example, through French. Friars are brothers. That's where they get their word. You learn to spot these. Typically, a Latinate, that is a Romance cognate of an Old Germanic B word, will have an F. The b, which became a b in Germanic, generally became an F in Latin. So I'm not ever going to quiz you on that, but now you know it. And that's how we get bear in modern English, and we get ferro, as in transfer, to carry. Anyway, duh goes to duh. We have the Sanskrit verb, bandhnati, which is to bind, and we have the English word to bind. Now, the Sanskrit word has a verb ending on it, but you can see the bond there in the English bind, and the Persian band, which means the exact same thing. There again, it happens that ancient Persian did, Proto-Iranian, ancient Persian had a change that was similar to what happened in the Germanic languages, but it's not part of the Germanic sound shift. That's its own history. And of course the g becomes g. A little difficult to find these because the g didn't survive well in really any of the modern languages or most ancient ones. But there are a few examples. So remember this. Here's another example of it. If an Indo-European word was part of the Proto-Germanic language and persists from the Proto-Germanic language into the old or modern versions of a Germanic language, then it has to show the shift. It has to show the shift. All the tribe who went off saying pater and started saying father, every last one of their P sounds became a f, except for a few kinds of consonant clusters. But don't pin me down on it. All of their P sounds became a f sound, and all of the daughter languages kept that change for all of those words. They never shifted them back. They kept it. This is like a law of physics if you're going to use it for the historical analysis of these languages. If you get words in a language that obviously break Grimm's law, they have to be explained. We can't just say, oh, Grimm's law didn't really work. Grimm's law always works. Grimm's law happened. It was a historical event. It was a fact. All the P's from Proto-Indo-European shifted in Germanic to F's. And, of course, all those other parts of Grimm's law happened too, right? So all the B's became B, like a law of physics. What that means is if you think you see something breaking the law, there has to be an explanation that accounts for this reality. There has to be another way to explain it. Just like gravity is a law of physics, and if you let go of stuff, it falls down. If you let go of a balloon and it floats up, it's not because gravity didn't work right. It's because there's an explanation for that behavior that includes the law of gravity. And that's how we have to treat a law like Grimm's law, and in fact, other systematic changes to language. So what do we do when we look in English and we find words like patronize and paternal and paternity and patriot? We say, my gosh, these are definitely Indo-European cognates with father, and they definitely don't show the Germanic sound shift. How on earth can we account for their presence in English? And often the answer is something like borrowing. We can say, look, we can look at the historical record and say there are plenty of reasons that those were borrowed into English from Latin vocabulary. And in fact, we can complicate that a little more and say, you know, some of them were borrowed in lots of different ways because Latin has its own history of borrowing. So it's no problem for us to say that patriarch was a Greek word that was borrowed into the Latin because of, for religious reasons, which then went into French, and then English speakers probably knew both the French and the Latin, and maybe the Greek word when they started using it. What this means is that we can look into English or any Germanic language for words that break Grimm's law and identify them sometimes as borrowings. When we look into Old English and we find the word cup and we see the Latin word cupa, the simplest explanation is the word was borrowed. And so also candle, church, which was kirk, and it's still kirk in Scottish, priest, German Käse, which the K became a ch in English, and cheese. All of these are borrowings from Latin or in one case Greek, and we can identify them as things that don't fit the historical pattern of English because they break Grimm's law. If it starts with a B in Latin and we know it's a good old Latin word, and it starts with a B in English, something's wrong and we have to come up with an explanation. Pardon me, borrowing is frequently the answer. And you can reconcile this too to our knowledge of history. We know that Germanic speakers adopted Christianity through contact with Latin-speaking Southern Europeans, Catholics, and so this religious vocabulary very predictably comes from the Latin language where they learned their religion. Pepper, very reasonably, of course it doesn't grow in Europe, so it's a trade good and it's necessarily going to be purchased and borrowed along with its name from the people who were trading in it. Northern Europeans were not building paved roads in the ancient times, and when they learned about this Roman phenomenon of having a strata or a stratum or strata all over the place, they borrowed the word, and it's now street. We can also explain some borrowings that have to go the other direction. So French is an interesting case. On the one hand, it's a Romance language. On the other hand, it has a long contact with Germanic languages, some of which are now vanished, like Frankish, an ancient and early medieval language there. And so we know that there are some Germanic words that pop up in French, and in fact one here in Finnish, which even your book mentions, the Kuningas one. That's a very famous one because this Finnish borrowing of the word king preserves a truly ancient form, an otherwise unattested form of Kuningas from Proto-Germanic. We know it must have existed, and there it is, fossilized in Finnish, even though it lost that z ending in all of the Germanic languages. So, Grimm's Law. Grimm's Law describes a historical process, a sound shift, where Proto-Germanic speakers shifted the use of consonants in their language in a systematic way that pervaded the entire language. And so now there is this kind of genetic mutation in the sound system of the Germanic languages that lets us identify them as a distinctive branch within the Indo-European languages. And it also helps us keep track of different parts of the vocabulary. When we spot vocabulary in a Germanic language that isn't following Grimm's Law, we have to figure out why it's not following Grimm's Law. And frequently, the answer will be, it was borrowed.